It is in the framework of this second type of questions that I have undertook several historical inquiries about madness or medicine, crime and punishment, or about sexuality. Of course, there have been several ways, and there are still several ways for elaborating those questions about our historical ontology. But I think that any ontological history of ourselves have to analyze three sets of relations: our relations to truth, our relations to obligation, our relations to ourselves and to the others. Or, to turn it with other words, in order to answer the question, what are we now? We have to consider that we are thinking beings, since it is through thought that we are beings who look for truth, who accept or refuse obligations, laws, coercions, and who are related to ourselves or to the others. My aim is not to answer the general question, what is a thinking being? My aim is to answer the question, how did the history of our thought, I mean of our relation to truth, to obligations, to ourselves and to the others, make us what we are? In brief, how could we analyze the formation of ourselves through the history of our thought? And by thought, I do not mean exclusively philosophy, nor theoretical thinking, nor scientific knowledge. I don't want to analyze what people think opposed to what they do, but what they think, what they do when they are, what they think when they do what they are doing. What I want to analyze is the meaning they give to their own behavior, the way they integrate their behavior in general strategies, the type of rationality they recognize in their different practices, institutions, models, and behavior. When I was studying madness and psychiatry, crime and punishment, I have been led to emphasize the analysis of our relation first to truth and then to obligation. Studying now the constitution of our experience of sexuality, I have been more and more inclined to pay attention to the relation to oneself and to the techniques through which those relations have been shaped. In order to analyze these techniques of the self, I'd like to choose as a point of departure a notion which has been, I think, very important in the Greek and in the Roman culture. I'll try tonight to give you a very short draft of the problems linked to this notion, and maybe we could elaborate this first resume during the meetings and seminars we'll have together during the next weeks. This notion, which I have chosen as a point of departure, is what the Greeks called epimeleia heautou, and the Latins cura sui. It's not very easy to translate these terms, but I'll try. Epimeleia heautou is something like the concern with oneself, or, as we say in French, le souci de soi. The verbal form epimeleistai heautou means something like to be concerned with oneself, to take care of oneself, s'occuper de soi-même. The precept that one has to take care of oneself, to be concerned with oneself, precept that one has to epimeleistai heautou, was for the Greeks and the Romans one of the main principles of ethics, one of the main rules for their art of life, and this for almost 1,000 years. Let's have a look at some marking points in this very long period. First, Socrates himself. In the Apology, written by Plato, We see Socrates presenting himself before his judges as the master of the concern with oneself. He addresses passers-by and tells them, "You concern yourselves with your riches, with your reputation, with your honors, but you do not concern yourself with your virtue or with your soul." And Socrates watches over his fellow citizens to make sure that they take care of themselves. He considers that this task has been conferred on him by the god, and he will not abandon it except with his last breath. Well, 8 centuries later, the same notion of concern with oneself, epimeleia heotu, the same notion appears with a role equally very important in a Christian author, Gregory of Nyssa. But it has, in Gregory of Nyssa, a very different meaning. By this term, Gregory of Nyssa means the movement by which one renounces marriage, detaches oneself from the flesh, and by which, thanks to a virginity of heart and body, one recovers the immortality of which one has been deprived. In another passage of the same treatise of virginity, Gregory makes of the parable of the lost drachma the model of concern with oneself. For a lost drachma, you must light a lamp, turn the whole house over, search in every corner, until, gleaming in the shadows, you see the coin's metal. In the same way, in order to recover the effigy which God has printed in our soul and which the body has tarnished, one must take care of oneself, light the lamp of reason, and search every corner of the soul. Between those two extreme points of reference, Socrates and Gregory of Nyssa, one can state that the concern with oneself constituted not only a constant principle, but a very large practice. Amongst those philosophers who claim to be advisors on life and guides on existence, the principle of occupying oneself with oneself was almost universally accepted. Following their master, the Epicureans repeat that it is never too early and never too late to occupy oneself with one's soul. Musonius Rufus, from amongst the Stoics, says also, it is in constantly paying attention to oneself that one assures one's salvation. Or Seneca, you must attend to your soul, attend to yourself, lose no time doing so. Retire into yourself and stay there. Dio of Prusa gives one lecture over to the necessity of an eis eoton anachoresis, a retreat into oneself. And Galen, recalling how much time it is necessary to train a doctor, an orator, or a grammatician, thinks that even more time is necessary to become a good man. Years and years, he says, spent in occupying yourself with yourself. Epictetus, in one of his diatribae, gives this definition of human being. Man is this unique kind of beings on the earth who have to take care of themselves. Nature has provided animals with everything they need. Humans don't have the same natural equipment, but we must understand that the necessity of taking care of ourselves is also a supplementary gift which has been bestowed. God has confided us to ourselves, giving us by this means the possibility and the duty of being free. For Epictetus, the epimeleia heotu, which is ontologically linked to human finitude, is the practical form of freedom. And it is by taking care of himself that human being becomes similar to God, God who has nothing else to do than taking care of himself. For us now, the notion of epimeleia heotu is faded and obscure. It seems to have been covered over either by the Socratic precept gnoti seoton or by the Christian principles of asceticism, which implies renouncing to oneself. To that extent that if we are asked what was the most important moral principle and the most characteristic in ancient philosophy, the answer which comes immediately to mind is not epimele seoto, take care of yourself, but, as you know, gnoti seoton, know yourself. Perhaps our philosophical and historical tradition has somehow overrated the importance of the gnoti seoton, of the know yourself. One must remember that the rule of having to know oneself was, in fact, and in the ancient culture, constantly associated with that of concerning oneself with oneself. And more than that, to know oneself was considered as a means for taking care of oneself. And when we consider Christian asceticism, we are used to underscore the rule of renouncing oneself, and we forget that in the spiritual experience of some early Christians like Gregory of Nyssa, renouncing oneself was a way of taking care of oneself, or at least a new form of the old philosophical epimeleia eotu. And I think that we have to be aware that those two great figures of the Western experience of the self-knowledge and asceticism, those two great figures are rooted in this multi-secular tradition of the care of the self being at the same time in the Greco-Roman culture a notion, a precept, an attitude and a technique, a practical matrix for the experience of the self. Most of the historians of ancient philosophy are concerned with the rise of ontology and metaphysics from Parmenides to Aristoteles through Plato. Most of the historians of Greek sciences are interested in the rise of rational thought through mathematics and cosmology. I think it could be valuable to study also the rise of a certain type of subjectivity, of a certain type of relation to oneself in this Greco-Latin culture of the self. Greek metaphysics has been determinant for our philosophical relationship to being. Greek science has been determinant for our rational relationship to the world. The Greco-Roman culture of the self has been, I think, determinant for our ethical relationship to ourselves. And my dream would be, if I could find people interested in the same topics, to start an historical analysis of those techniques of the self in the Western societies from the beginning of the Greek civilization. My intention tonight is to present you a very brief survey of some aspects of this culture of the self in the Greek and in the Greco-Roman civilization. And I'll take only two views on this culture of the self, one in the 4th century before Christ, and the other on the 2 first centuries of our era.